What is a parent? A guardian? Caretaker? Role model? Perhaps an individual that endures a burden to cultivate young life. Objectively labeling someone a parent was never difficult, but measuring the efficacy of that person was. Some cultures believe that a parent can be a community, quotations of, "it takes a village," and that biological ties aren't as significant as studies suggest. Some anecdotal cultural perceptions think that the fathers are insignificant, decreasing the value of men in parenthood, or on the contrary, believe single mothers should be demonized for perceived poor decision-making in partners, and irrational decisions on the basis of neuroticism being more common in women. Parenting has become a paradox in society, as it is what created foundational merit for those existing today, but that, in turn, gave birth to a generation that is less likely to become parents themselves, leading to an overall decrease in families. What happened? The people that become parents are synonymous with the functionality of the family. Today, we intend to explore the current stigmas and variables revolving around parenting, what it actually means, and why we stopped communicating that desire, reducing such a pursuit overall. So we've recently covered a video on the channel by Fats with an intriguing title of "It's Not Just You, No One Wants Kids Anymore." And it got me thinking, is it really that simple? The overarching point of the video was that economies do not facilitate the sufficient environments for such a pursuit to happen, that having children was mainly pushed forward by government entities to continue the meat grinder of financial stability in societies. As I see people with less and more still having familial pursuits or ideations, I was intimidated at the thought of how much of a can of worms this might become should I dive into it. Seems like every variable I find connected to the paradox of parenting becomes another rabbit hole that presents its own issues. Looking at the American economy was the easiest part because it is so objective. However, the other variables were far from that. I see the undesiring of children as an effect, not a cause, and I decided to explore this concept more thoroughly through the perspective and attitude of American culture. Naturally, measuring inadequate character and immorality is almost a scientific impossibility because not all evil breaks laws, and not all true selves come to light due to self-reporting being skewed by fragile ego and the subconscious. What can be looked at are patterns and consistencies that can predict schemas people build toward the decision of becoming parents or not. We're going to take a look at various phenomena affecting American attitude, a few more common than others. Some of the debates circling around current phenomena are things such as people with children versus people without. There are large debates and moral implications coming from two sides. Both can have alternating views, but there's a running theme for each condition. The group with the condition of children typically understand themes like sacrifice and fulfillment a bit more often than their comparative counterparts. Childbirth and parenting are often associated with great themes of maturity, so naturally, there's often a skewed perspective between these two samples. Additionally, depending on the immediate culture and societies we grow up in, it further pushes or pulls us in directions of beliefs and habits. The farther away people are from nuclear families, the less they believe in its purpose, while on the contrary, the closer people are to it, the more they believe in its significance. Nuclear families have existed in all cultures in the US, and in all cultures, it has been beneficially measured, regardless of race or ethnicity. Nuclear family is in reference to co-parenting, dual parenting under the same roof, with all children having biological ties. Cultures with less traditional habits of nuclear families often do poorly in comparison to these counterparts. Another phenomenon affecting the stigma in relation to economic standing and American attitude is economic standing related to optimism. America as a developed country breeds its own unintentional maladaptive existences when compared to developing or lesser countries in economic standing, typically leading to the outcome of a multi-analysis of studies associating optimism with economic standing. In short, countries with more are often less optimistic, and countries with less are often more optimistic. Why? Objectively measuring the morality of cognition is as hard to do as proving why Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a foundation of human psychology. The correlation above measures two things: the orientation of struggle and the paradox of privilege. If we were to use the term to describe the opposite of optimism, it would be pessimism, or the idea of being unhappy in one's country, leading to two outcomes: The more you have, the less you struggle, the more you complain. And the alternative, the less you have, the more you struggle, the less you complain. If it is a norm to have less, then the bitterness of failure doesn't strike as hard into the consciousness of dividing the have and have-nots. In less developed countries and cultures, you focus less on the difference and are more self-oriented towards daily purpose or duty. Being born in America is a privilege. Not only is this a perception of more than half of the country, but also a historical perception of developing countries, hence the migration, on large scales in the past century alone. Americans are privileged by birthright, but subcultures in the US have divided this into a spectrum so severe as to deal in absolutes, that you are either privileged or not, which is a contradiction of what it is to be privileged. Instead, the truth is that privilege in the US is a spectrum, not a yes or no. Some families are more privileged than others, but that doesn't reduce the privilege of the families being compared. In the 1930s, the Jews fled Nazi Germany, established a hardworking community in the US, granting privilege based on merit and effort to the families that followed. They came with nothing and built what they had. Similarly, migrants from Africa, during variations of genocide and inducted slavery in Africa throughout the 20th century, were able to accomplish the same. During World War II, equivalent data was found for the Japanese. If the concept of privilege didn't exist in the view of America, then these countries and these people wouldn't have migrated as they did. The idea that we have less in comparison to those that have more is irrelevant in whether we are privileged or not. We are all privileged. But the attitude of privilege, inherently negative ones, puts a dim view on what we feel is financially capable. Two other phenomenon that has been occurring in America for the past 50 years has been the marriage crisis and father absence. In reference to marriage crisis, marital bonds have been losing value over time in societal perspective. But however, marital bonds have not lost value in reference to its benefit to children. Sexual inclination outside of marital bonds was first openly expressed in the 1960s, making sexual practices or the idea of intimacy less exclusive, while also motivating the idea that it should be explored. This further desensitized the significance of setting genuine interpersonal relationships, chanting beliefs that women should have sex with whoever, whenever, wherever. And this was the first movement outside of current technology to have such a nationwide effect. What we're seeing in current hookup culture are evolved practices of those movements. Obviously, this had a direct and indirect effect on marriage competency and occurrence. Whether people get married or not is a different issue. Genuine relationships may have been wounded forever. And with no genuine relationships, and if all that mostly remains are reckless decisions in partners, you forego commitment and overlook the character of those involved, often leading to another outcome, a more wounding outcome. In reference to the father paradox, the stability of society was often linked to nuclear families and created it as a norm up until the 1960s. Following the 1960s, the concepts of nuclear families were being pushed less by the government and more by the traditions of families that found success in them. Transitioning from a national norm to a cultural norm, and being that many subcultures exist in America, not all cultures pass this norm along, leading to the less efficient outcomes of some cultures. Essentially, the cultures that pursued the tradition of nuclear families less ended up performing worse than the cultures that kept it. Fatherlessness is a self-caused disease and the outcome of several different activist agendas, government implementation, and overall cowardice. Feminism had a large role in its toxic perceptions towards the significance of men. The government implementing methods of aborting children and birth control while also incentivizing single mother parenting. The cowardice is in reference of men who ran from the responsibility of children after having them. The blame is on all sides. These outcomes bred different perspectives that destroyed traditional constructs formed before the 1960s and has corroded over time. With all this talk about parenting, I figured we'd take a second to objectively look at what it means, what it is, and the roles that are often involved. As a disclaimer, the themes mentioned are potential outcomes of mature input into the developmental dimension of parenting. Not all parents are good parents, as equal to the idea that not all people are good people. What dictates the outcome of parenting is the level of maturity that someone reaches prior to being involved with children. As defined by the American Psychological Association, the major goals of parenting, and parenting by definition, is the process of raising children and providing for their care and protection to ensure their healthy development into adulthood. It involves nurturing, guiding, and protecting children to help them prepare for independence. Now that captures a universal perspective, but I think it's important to dive into the gender roles that can be involved. Additionally, the hormonal differences between men and women following puberty have been measured substantially and continuously over centuries. In addition to hormonal responses, variations of brain activity and lobe sizes have been the newest observances within the differences of men and women, which further proves biological predispositions amongst the genders, with millions of years of evolution equipping them to be naturally fit for different specifics of their parenting roles. Although men and women handle things like stress, purpose, fulfillment, and maturity differently, one constant is shared amongst both: having children. We are indeed equipped to have a natural desire to be parents, so social constructs and environmental contexts obstructing and sometimes even surrendering that desire is alarming. In reference to men, why are men needed? Men have the biological predisposition of being the provider, the protector, and often the structure and safety of the home or of the child's life. Men often benefit behavioral problems in boys and reduce psychological problems in girls. Fathers bear the weight of being the most significant variable throughout children's socialization process, where learning acceptable behavior, structure, and response are paramount from the ages of 4 to 10 years old. The issues of current society in reference to biological predisposition of men is if women can self-provide in most cases, what is the significance of men and why do they still matter? Or should they? There has been a massive narrative in reference to the fact that some people believe that men aren't needed. Several studies suggest this is not the case, and that the attitude of men not being needed is a disease in reference to the growth of children when you compare children who have their fathers and children who don't. Naturally, the narrative that men aren't needed is coming from women. So let's look at why women are needed. Women are hallmark nurturers, feminine with tender care, naturally compassionate towards objects and persons of loving perspective. If men are the physical shield from the world, women are the emotional one, cultivating compassion and nurturement in the face of hardships that children experience, from simple difficulties to complex ones. The delicate feminism that women often establish in motherhood often builds a spiritual foundation for children to rely on during emotional crises during various points in their youth. However, women fail almost certainly as an authority figure, as women lack the physical presence and consistencies put forth by the subconscious and ego of male presences. It can be considered a leading contributor to why boys in single mother households are far more likely to be incarcerated. Women often have the most impact from birth up until the age of 4 on average. And the reason that's usually the case is because of the amount of change and exposure that occurs not only in the child, but in the mother during those moments of vulnerability and care. Women are often critical in the assurance of attachment and often represent the first attachment that the child would ever experience. Women often navigate this condition rather naturally, while men aren't as naturally compassionate or as intimate with very vulnerable entities. For the first time in that woman's life, she is not only physically bonding to something that is organically from her own existence, but because whether she is egotistical or not, she now fears for the safety of something that isn't herself. And the measured effects of a newborn is how beneficial those consistent notions of warmth and care tend to help emotionally develop the child into adolescence, where the influences and effects of motherhood start to taper off. The current issues in modern societies that women are facing is that women are often having more masculine upbringings, as it benefits to climb corporate ladders, to be isolated parents or single parents. Adopting various forms of masculinity hurts the capability of most mothers. However, women often have leniency towards accountability and responsibility, typically leading to less fortuitous relationships, and often commit more predatory practices in reference to relational violence. In reference to women needing protection in the home, in current society, women can often purchase, secure, grab a weapon, and that'll help limit the dangers that may be faced. However, that does not translate to a proper authority figure in the eyes of children, which still leaves us with the necessity of both genders significantly and severely. The importance of bringing the scope towards fathers over mothers is to address the absence effect. In the face of single mothers and fathers, 1 in 5 children live with a single father, whereas the majority live with single mothers. On average, the mother is not absent, the father is. Although many issues can be addressed, the 4 constant variables that I seem to find as significant contributors to the patterns that exist in the United States is economic, character, technology, and culture. As I previously stated, the most objective is economics. Inflation and ability to own homes has been a massive issue. Property prices increase while wages hardly match. If we are never financially set, then it is less likely for us to think that we're financially capable to become parents or to involve anybody into our lives. Career orientation of men and women can often be the issue. Men typically pursue career and academic paths towards higher paying jobs involving engineering, manual labor, things that benefit the use of gross motor skills, while women typically pursue more humane, art, and societal career paths, which unfortunately translate to lesser paying jobs. If women are often the primary parent in the United States, having lesser paying jobs does not help this concept, nor does it help the ability to instill the belief that it can be done. Naturally, capitalism is the main system in place in the United States, and it's a bit of a double-edged sword. The American dream is much harder to reach than ever before. Certain circumstances of capitalism pressure the condition of extended family living or conjugal family structures. However, capitalism as a whole grants greater reward than risk, even in 2024, with several metrics displaying more benefit than harm, even though the harm should be addressed. Millions of Americans are still navigating their way through the economic ladder, while others aren't, which leads to the second variable we'll put forth. But to finish up, in the past 4 years, the cost of owning a home has doubled. It can't be argued how significant socioeconomic progress is. If we cannot own homes, then how likely is it that we'll have a family? However, a critical question often arises. Why aren't we in better positions? And how much of it is our own fault? We often devoid ourselves of the idea that perhaps we should become something like a greater sense of ourselves before we make a judgment of our readiness for something like children. Although economic crises can obstruct the obvious paths, it just means we typically must work harder or become better for equivalent success in comparison to older generations. Whether that's fair or not is irrelevant because life doesn't cater to what's fair. It caters to what you can do. It caters to competence and capability. Character can often be measured by the how in reference to one's own life. Being considerate, self-critical and aware, resilient, mindful, confident, capable of sacrifice, and have faith in either yourself or something more abstract, then one might say that person has good character. It's not a checklist that leads to a yes or no, but the more of these qualities a person might have, one might say they have a greater sense of character. Such deficits can be seen in the American workforce, and some organizations war on merit, as diversity seems to be a little more important than competence and work ethic. Another measure is something that has lost its meaning: the absence of maturity. Immaturity in its primal, more monstrous form. You're going to be more concerned with how people treat you than how you treat people. You see a lot of it with identity politics. You also see it in relationships. Most of it is externalized blame, not realizing the hypocrisy of their demands. They're more concerned with someone treating them in a way they demand, and not at all concerned with the conformity and social pressure they're putting onto others. If something like political identity, something that will be reiterated later, is obstructing relationships, then we're allowing political identity to supersede personal identity, which is very dangerous when discussing personal trajectory. There's something beautiful about everyone's uniqueness, and I don't think people are aware of the negative effects during that form of social regression. Various articles put forth beliefs that we know we're not where we want to be, when either we're being bad to good people, in other words, preying upon them, or even being good to bad people. And that's not in the essence of charity. It's within the notion that you're allowing yourself to be preyed upon by predatory personalities and not defending yourself in the process. It's synonymous with our own naivety. That's not what we do in maturity. If we're constantly betrayed, why didn't we see it? And why did we ignorantly believe that the good we wanted to exist in the person we're with was going to counterbalance all the evil in that same person that's present, that we clearly casted away because our own belief perseverance, granting them the benefit of the doubt at the cost of our own respect. We were more concerned about what we wanted it to be versus what it actually is or was. Now, in the transcendence of that is obviously a different outcome, in which case maturity can often be achieved when you establish the ability to care about something else more than you care about you. And that's not to be confused with the alternative. You must care about you before you can care about something other than you. An example, naturally and ironically, this happens when most people become parents. Not miraculously, but over time they come to the realization of maturity should they choose to seek it. Not to say that children are required in order to obtain maturity. However, I will admit it is substantially more difficult to venture the world, expose yourself to multiplicative forms of chaos in order to learn what it means to invest in something that isn't you. Elements of character can be universal, but how do they differ between men and women? Well, you use the tools and fruits of billions of years of evolution. Men are often more disagreeable and conscientious, often leading to more constructive and structured, disciplined lifestyles and financial preparedness or position. The lack of that can become monstrous if they're not morally developed or mature. Men can become obsessive over power, drives of physical humiliation, and seeking means of significance and importance through externalized factors like practices of being predatory towards women, addiction, or even living in the past. Women, on the other hand, are often more agreeable and neurotic, and women can use that to their benefit by honing compassion and humility, becoming socially benevolent in practice. Women fall short when they adopt more masculine features for relational use, but also become more relationally violent and manipulative. Additionally, what you might see in some cases of immature women is the desiring of the image versus desiring the duty. They might be willing to grasp at the label of wife or mother or some form of job title and use it without the sacrifice. Women in immature states typically are not confident in interpersonal decisions because choices are based on impulse and not on depth, leading to pursuits of feelings and not progress. Elements of character can often be easily perceived. Children often become our own forms of integrity. If we're not ready to be something that is ready to be watched at all times, then perhaps we have a bit of work to do. Additionally, if we're choosing partners that we don't believe in, or we're not making relational decisions in delayed or in-depth formats, it's very likely that we won't ever establish the confidence to take on more responsibility like children. There's an old saying in reference to men. It is that you'll find good things once you find your wife. And the idea behind that is not when you found a woman that all of a sudden you're the tyrant and a woman is going to come prepackaged as perfect. Obviously, that's a monstrous interpretation. It's more something like when you've developed and built a relationship with a woman to be able to reach that stage of cohesiveness, an equivalent plane of existence, that you'll establish something beautiful and rewarding. But in order to have faith in an outcome, there has to be connections, which have been increasingly hard to make, leading to our next variable. A newer obstacle that is starting to see far more light is technology. The accessibility of technology is incredible, from handheld devices to consistent and casual addictions. However, technology has contributed to negative cognitions across a grand scale. Technology and the use of social media has contributed to mob mentality and inducing less responsibility in online conduct, which bleeds into real-life behaviors. There has also been negative effects on children and adults. In reference to children and its use in academic environment, they have seen increases in cognitive reaction, but the use of online education has also reduced children's attentiveness. Other areas that it increases is isolation and observation in periods where imaginative play should take place, or efforts towards speech. If children are constantly watching something, they're spending a lot less time doing and talking. This in itself can often cripple the behavior of children as that leads into adulthood. Whereas adults, in addition to reduction of responsibility, conditions like the Tinder brain occur. Or through various forms of online dating, the idea of the grass is always greener reduces the concepts of commitment or the significance of them, because it is better to believe we can find something better than work on what we currently have. Additionally, echo chambers is starting to be a predominant force in the use of technology and online platforms. If all we have are thoughts and conversations that agree with our beliefs, then we remain belittled and less because nothing is challenging us in the way we think and who we are. And that essence of exposed chaos is often necessary for personal growth and establishing maturity for self, to be willing and able to take on people's opinions, whether you agree or disagree, all leading to the overall approach that connecting online or being in agreement in a virtual space is more important than physical success in relationships and reaching the fulfillment of genuine social connection. And the constants that online spaces allow turn into a form of catharsis for people's ability to communicate or overall acceptance through digital popularity, lowering the meaning of other people or the essence of being human. When we degrade what makes us socially acceptable or socially altruistic, we remove the uniqueness of our upbringings and the history that may be involved. Variations of characterological development that stood the test of time from our parents to theirs, to further through our ancestry. Elements like culture are so important, but obviously in America can be such a divisive topic. One might argue that the reason America is great is for its combination of cultures, contributing to various values, traditions, and long-standing historical attitudes. Freedom of expression was an essential amendment considering America's history in the 18th century. However, in modern America, perhaps that freedom also allowed for more radical input. Although culture is multiplicatively impactful on several fronts and used to not be so much of an issue, the overabundance of subcultures are now fighting for space, forcing technology to be a toxic bridge where most don't communicate the previous ideas of respect and understanding, and instead create more divide and social conformity. One of the friction points can be traditional foundations in the face of modern influence. I prefaced this earlier regarding the outcome of migrants in the 20th century, and we've been seeing disparities of those generations in modern society. Currently, those migrant cultures have combated various forms of Western ideology and American attitudes. Not all American culture is seen as wrong or negative, but majority of migrants during these earlier time periods bared witness to several activist movements that do not co-align with their cultural traditions, leading to confusion in homes and parenting with the generations that followed. As time passed, there were several studies that covered the comparison and correlation of cultures that retained their unique and migrant tradition and those that did not. Essentially, cultures that retained more tradition through that time period are often better off now than the cultures that didn't. However, various forms of conjugal families are seeing almost equivalent success as nuclear families. Conjugal families or extended families are becoming more frequent due to capitalism putting more pressure on youth obtaining immediate success. However, these families fall short on structure and solidified roles due to the association of additional influences and environmental contexts that are typically involved in extended families. A more monstrous example are the subcultures of incels and feminists, both perfect examples of technological abuse, whether through excessive consumption of pornographic material and the effects that has on cognition, or social media content and the addiction there. In addition to other warring subcultures in the political sphere, one of the most recent issues and one that has found an abnormal amount of importance is political conformity, meaning more than personal identity. Several demonstrations have surrounded the Donald J. Trump election, people ending marriages, people ending relationships. Other more continuous issues can be found in American subcultures conflicting over race, class, and even values like patriotism or concepts like masculinity. As I stated previously, culture used to be something that was introduced, understood, and respected. Now, if there's a disagreement amongst different American subcultures, it's likely seen as an act of hostility, an attack on our own identities, a threat. With such heightened divisiveness in values, and if a family requires shared or respected values, it puts an initial obstacle in any newly formed relationship or attempts at one because of all the activism and current momentous beliefs. Each variable mentioned is its own knot to untangle. Even throughout this video, we've only scratched the surface in their contribution to the attitude of parental decrease. And as the variables were analyzed, the basis of their existence was as well. Clearly, there's a lot of difficulties, lots of obstacles and conflict, but a little bit of story time. When I was in the infantry, 11 Bravo for the United States Army, we had something called 5 to 25s. It was a concept used during patrols or foot patrols in Afghanistan. Essentially, the premise was to be sure that IED or explosive devices were not in your immediate proximity. And so you would constantly look at anything that was 5 meters close to you to 25 meters away from you, continuously looking back and forth throughout the entire patrol. In short, what's often the closest to you is the most important and dangerous. And then you gradually looked outwards before looking back at you. The analogy in that is this: we are often our own biggest sources of issues. And if we're not self-oriented before we look outwards, then it's likely that something will blow up in our faces, which initiates one of the first perspectives that we need to take on, which is facing the inadequacy of ourselves. We need to address the resentment. What about our life that we haven't dealt that is currently making us bitter? Additionally, we need to improve our articulation. If we don't know how to communicate what we're going through, who we are, and what we feel, then our confidence in communication will always be sparse and hard to commit to. Also, we need to accept responsibility and be aware of our externalized blaming factors. If we're not going to be self-oriented, we're typically going to place blame on things outside of our own control. If we're going to be blinded as to what we should do next for ourselves, it is highly unlikely that we're ever going to reach a better sense of self to be able to achieve the things mentioned previously. The world will be what it is, but life is 10% of what the world does and 90% of how we react to it. Another analogy is that you're not a master of the sea until you've made it through the storm. And essentially what that means is your measure of self isn't when everything's peaceful, content, calm. The measure of yourself is when chaos ensues and you're trying to manage. And if we ever want to know where we are, look at how we are in those moments. Chaos is nothing but an opportunity. If we can apply order found in your own life is almost always going to translate to order found in the home. And genuine order in the home provides proactive preparedness to the world's chaos. Whether that sounds poetic or not doesn't matter, because it's very much true. In the face of economic disparity, we need to find the balance between success and passion in reference to our careers. If we know that being an artist isn't going to pay the bills, then we need to circumvent what that job is or what that career can be while finding something that does grant our success while still adhering to our passion. Is it a possibility that that passion has to become a hobby while we maintain a different kind of career-based pursuit? It's highly likely in most cases. Additionally, I'm going to address the confusion in reference to parenting. What is the job of a parent? Well, we've heard some objective measures, but overall, it is to ensure the physical welfare and mental fortitude of a child. Protect them, primarily, to ensure they reach adulthood, but not in the sense that you shelter them. When you shelter children, you're admitting your inadequacy to prepare them, so you choose to shield them from it all. And it's no wonder they become so fragile, which will eventually upset you. That's no good. You need to be mature enough to be able to explain and demonstrate the cruelty in the world that exists. You protect them by preparing them. Preparedness is an aspect of proactive safety. Develop them to be morally, socially acceptable in a way they'll navigate life adequately and willingly. Instill the ability to distinguish between the spectrum of trust from naive to sincere. Being able to go from the ignorantly blind and gullible way of thinking that no one will do you harm to making confident judgments in the face of someone else's actions and being able to interpret their intentions. Lastly, define and demonstrate what it means to win at life, or having the know-how to be able to explain to your children or future children how winning at life is different than the competitive outcome often found in shallow performance. That although you may lose a toy, you may win a game in sports, these are not measurable in reference to character. The winning defined by character is the manner in which you won, or your display of attitude when you lost. That will dictate whether you are winning or losing in whatever stage of life you may find yourself in. From elementary to adulthood, we often have notions that if we didn't perform well, then our personal value is tied to the performance. In a negative sense, that can go one of two ways, where we become comforted with our defeats and feel like success isn't necessary, or we become obsessively tyrannical with our performances to the point where every performance in itself is a permanent judgment. In this condition, if we don't win or do the impressive thing, or in other cases beat everyone, which the tyrant or egotistical personality typically expects, then we feel like we're nothing, which is monstrous in its own way. We can't forget the significance of learning. Appropriate orientation of knowing how to win builds resilience in self and later in children because you learned how to do it for you. For those that strongly disagree with me or want to insult me in the comments, well, it's fair to say that you don't know me or made it far enough to fully understand the perspective or took the time to accept the data, in addition to someone else's opinion. Naturally, I don't have to accept yours either. I understand that accepting self as the locus of responsibility and inadequacy is a tough pill to swallow, but that's why we ourselves should be the only hill that we're willing to die on until we gain far more ground in our potential, in our quest for maturity. I don't think it's quite clear to everyone how immaturity has become a norm. I don't think it's so clear to everyone how dangerous and costly casual relationships are and how much psychopathy or predatory practices it procreates. These things put such a dampener, a cap on our potential. And it's no wonder we never come to the realization that we, in our miserable, sorry states, could become something great enough to be a role model for young life. I mean, you have beliefs floating around like how children are such burdens. Well, burdens to what exactly? Your own necessity of fun, the selfishness that you typically get into, the drinking that you still do, the hobby that you can't quit, the casual addictions that you still entertain. What exactly is a child getting in the way of? The variations of neglect that you have in your life? I think a lot of people are going to arrive to the point where there's a lot of shallow existence in their lives and it's devoid of meaning. But I think that's a tough pill for a lot of people to swallow, as I previously stated. I think ego is single-handedly destroying our ability to generate authentic interpersonal relationships. And even in data, as it displays, as egos become more fragile in society, self-reporting becomes less adequate even in science. I think that's a huge alarming factor, that we're not even going to be able to trust the data we receive because people are too fearful of exposing their true identities. We rather cover it up with nonsense. And I may get questions like, well, how do I know I'm ready to approach such a concept? And I think for men and women, the best way to go about it is to ask yourself a question. For men, obviously, if your son grew up to be just like you, would you be proud of that? Or if you had a daughter, would you want her to date a man like you? And are you comfortable with that? And then naturally with women, it's the same essence of would you want that child to become like you? And if we're devoid of shame or guilt and we think that we're fine as is and we haven't moved anywhere, then obviously that's going to be a naturally negative outcome. The idea of progressing into something like parenthood, we got to understand that what you have isn't always going to be what you want. But the idea of possession or thinking what you have in reference to relationships or children as something you own will drive a perspective of control and tyranny. It's less about bringing things to heal and more about putting the work into things that can evolve into what will morally and peacefully choose forever. And we got to understand, should we become mothers or fathers, we need to understand that we are people first. We are man before we're a father, and we're a woman before we're a mother. And how far we make it within those dimensions will dictate how good we become as fathers or mothers. We can reach points that are beyond redemption. It's a lie to embrace the idea that since life is supposed to be beautiful, that we are entitled to some form of development, that it's all going to work out eventually. But that's absurd. We have to have a horse in the race. We have to get our hands dirty. We're never going to ace that test if we sat around the whole semester with the presumption that our entitlement is going to save the day. It's that type of horizontal way of living that kills potential, kills dreams. Life is beautiful because in the finite space granted, we have the freedom to pursue so much in it, create so much with it, and to let that rot in front of our own eyes for the sake of remaining comfortable is such an utter disservice to our future selves. And the last thing, in reference to gauging relationships worth investing into for such concepts to be cultivated, and especially to the young, I know the idea of monogamy sounds restrictive, sounds like the antithesis of freedom. And it goes against what we commonly hear and are indoctrinated to believe. It combats the usual position that more is better or more is good. But having a bunch of things that mean close to nothing pales in comparison to the one thing that you can truly invest into. We all understand the concept of passion projects, and we all understand quality over quantity. Use what you know to pursue what you don't. As you grow up, it's always interesting to see how various things start to make more sense. And although that sounds like a recipe for I could just figure it out later, I ask you to pause for a second and give that some thought. The sooner you mature, the sooner you'll make decisions that you won't regret. And time is finite. Life is finite. I don't see a scenario where walking through your own fog longer than necessary is a benefit. So choose wisely, otherwise you'll be the oldest child you know. With that being said, thank you to everyone that watched the video. I know it's a little bit of a long one this time around, but it was a lengthy subject to cover and intimidated me myself. If you liked the video, like it, but especially comment in the comment section down below for your perspectives, your beliefs, and your way of handling the current issue of people becoming parents or not. Naturally, I put my perspective forward, starting with professional, ending it with personal. I would love to hear your thoughts. Thanks again, and I'll go ahead and see you next time.